The megachurch parking lot in Atlanta stretches across 23 acres, but on this particular Sunday morning in 2023, it's barely half full. Pastor David Richardson remembers when they had to turn people away, when the sanctuary overflowed with 15,000 worshipers, when the energy was so electric you could feel the Holy Spirit moving through the crowd like wildfire. Today, he's looking out at maybe 6,000 faces, and half of them are over 60. Down in Mississippi, Reverend Sarah Matthews unlocks the doors of First Baptist Church in Meridian, the same church where her grandfather preached fire and brimstone to packed pews for 37 years. She's been here for 8 years now, watching the congregation shrink like a wool sweater in hot water. Last month, for the first time in the church's 127-year history, more people left than joined. And it wasn't because they moved away or died, they just stopped coming. These aren't isolated incidents. They're snapshots of a seismic shift happening across the American South, in a region that once stood as the unshakable fortress of evangelical Christianity. The Bible Belt, that swath of states stretching from Texas to Virginia where church attendance was as routine as sweet tea and Sunday dinner, is experiencing something unprecedented. Doubt. Not doubt in God, necessarily, but doubt in institutions, traditions, and the very idea that faith and culture move in lockstep the way they did for generations. The Bible Belt isn't disappearing, but it's transforming in ways that would have been unimaginable just 20 years ago. And the story of how we got here is far more complex and fascinating than simple statistics about declining church membership. Let's travel back to Birmingham, Alabama, 1952. Dwight Eisenhower has just been elected president, and America is settling into the prosperous optimism of the post-war boom. At 16th Street Baptist Church, the Sunday service is standing room only, as it is at virtually every church across the South, regardless of denomination or race. But there's something else happening in Birmingham that most people don't see coming. A young minister named Martin Luther King Jr. has just arrived in nearby Montgomery, and the civil rights movement is about to use Southern churches as its launching pad. The very institutions that had long supported segregation and the racial status quo are about to become the vessels for revolutionary change. This tension between tradition and transformation would define the next 70 years of Southern religious life. The term Bible Belt itself was coined by journalist H. L. Mencken in 1925, intended as mockery of Southern religious fervor during the Scopes Monkey trial. But Southerners embraced the label with pride, turning an insult into an identity. For decades, this identity seemed unshakable. Church attendance rates in the South consistently ran 20 to 30% higher than the national average. Politicians couldn't win office without demonstrating their faith credentials. Businesses closed on Sundays as a matter of course. But even at the height of Bible Belt influence in the 1950s and 1960s, cracks were beginning to show. The integration struggles divided congregations that had seemed monolithically unified. White churches that supported segregation found themselves on the wrong side of moral arguments they had traditionally claimed to control. Black churches that led the freedom movement demonstrated forms of Christianity that challenged comfortable assumptions about faith and politics. Fast forward to 1976, and something remarkable happens. Jimmy Carter, a born-again Southern Baptist peanut farmer from Plains, Georgia, wins the presidency. His election should have been the Bible Belt's moment of ultimate triumph. One of their own in the White House, openly discussing his personal relationship with Jesus Christ. Instead, Carter's presidency marks the beginning of the Bible Belt's political and cultural transformation. Carter's brand of progressive Christianity didn't sit well with many Southern evangelicals. His support for the Equal Rights Amendment, his moderate positions on abortion, and his emphasis on human rights over anti-communism created a rift that many hadn't seen coming. By 1980, white evangelicals in the South were abandoning their fellow born-again Christian for Ronald Reagan, a divorced Hollywood actor from California who rarely attended church. This political realignment revealed something profound about Bible Belt identity that's still playing out today. For many Southerners, conservative politics had become more important than theological consistency. The marriage between evangelical Christianity and Republican politics, forged in the late 1970s and early 1980s, would reshape both religion and politics across the region. But let's pause here and dig into what we're really talking about when we say Bible Belt. The geographic boundaries have never been precise, but traditionally they encompass states like Alabama, Mississippi, Tennessee, Kentucky, Arkansas, Louisiana, Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, and parts of Texas, Virginia, West Virginia, and Florida. These states shared certain characteristics: high rates of Protestant church membership, conservative social attitudes, and political cultures deeply influenced by religious considerations. The statistics from the region's heyday tell a remarkable story. In 1965, church attendance in Mississippi reached 87% of the population. In Arkansas, it was 83%. Compare that to New York at 52%, or California at 49%, and you begin to understand the cultural gulf that separated the Bible Belt from the rest of America. These numbers reflected more than religious devotion. They represented a complete social system. Churches weren't just places of worship. They were community centers, social networks, political organizing hubs, and cultural arbiters. If you wanted to succeed in business, you joined the right church. If you wanted to meet a spouse, you went to church socials. If you wanted your voice heard on community issues, you spoke at church meetings. Hello there, history enthusiasts. Welcome back to Professor Archive, where we uncover the stories that shaped America in ways you might never have expected. Before we dive deeper into this transformation of the American South, I'm curious about our audience today. Where are you watching from? Are you sitting in one of these Bible Belt states I'm describing, or are you viewing this from somewhere else entirely? And here's something that might help us understand different perspectives. What's your profession? Are you a teacher trying to understand cultural change? Maybe a pastor wrestling with these shifts firsthand, or perhaps a student studying sociology or political science. Your background probably influences how you're hearing this story. The prosperity of the post-World War II era initially strengthened Bible Belt culture rather than weakening it. Unlike the industrial North, where prosperity often correlated with secularization, the South seemed to prove that you could have both material success and religious devotion. New suburban churches sprouted across the region like kudzu, architectural marvels with gymnasiums, fellowship halls, and parking lots designed for the car culture that was reshaping American life. Consider the story of Bellevue Baptist Church in Memphis, Tennessee. In 1952, it was a modest congregation of about 800 members meeting in a traditional brick building downtown. But under the leadership of Pastor Adrian Rogers, who arrived in 1972, Bellevue became something unprecedented. A Southern megachurch that combined traditional Baptist theology with contemporary marketing and entertainment techniques. By the 1980s, Bellevue boasted over 29,000 members, a sprawling suburban campus, television broadcasts reaching millions, and enough political influence to sway state elections. Rogers became a national figure in the conservative movement, helping to engineer the conservative resurgence that took control of the Southern Baptist Convention in the late 1970s and 1980s. But here's where the story gets interesting. Even as churches like Bellevue were reaching unprecedented size and influence, the seeds of future decline were being planted. The very success of megachurch culture began to change the fundamental nature of Southern Christianity in ways that its leaders didn't anticipate. Traditional Southern churches had been intensely personal and communal. Everyone knew everyone else's business, for better and worse. Ministers visited parishioners' homes. Church discipline was real and sometimes harsh, but this intimacy created bonds that were difficult to break. Leaving your church meant leaving your community, your social network, and often your economic prospects. Megachurches offered anonymity instead of intimacy. You could attend for years without anyone knowing your name, much less your personal struggles. This had obvious advantages: less judgment, more privacy, contemporary music, professional programming. But it also made leaving much easier. If church became inconvenient, boring, or uncomfortable, you could simply stop going without any real consequences. The rise of televangelism accelerated this trend toward religious consumerism. Why drive to church when you could get better preaching, music, and production values from the comfort of your living room? Successful television ministers like Pat Robertson, Jerry Falwell, and Jimmy Swaggart became more familiar to many Southern Christians than their own local pastors. But the televangelism boom of the 1980s also produced the first major credibility crisis for Bible Belt Christianity. Jim Backer's financial scandals, Jimmy Swaggart's sexual misconduct, and the lavish lifestyles of prosperity gospel preachers created widespread disillusionment among believers who had trusted these leaders implicitly. The scandals revealed something troubling about the relationship between faith and money in Bible Belt culture. The same region that prided itself on traditional values and moral authority was producing religious leaders who seemed more interested in private jets and luxury cars than serving the poor and needy. For many younger Southerners, this hypocrisy became impossible to ignore. Meanwhile, broader cultural changes were reshaping the context in which Bible Belt Christianity operated. Air conditioning made the region more attractive to outsiders, spurring massive migration from the north and west. These newcomers often brought different religious traditions: Catholicism, Judaism, non-denominational Protestantism, or no religion at all. The growth of universities across the South created intellectual environments that challenged traditional religious assumptions. Students who might have accepted their parents' faith without question found themselves exposed to scientific theories, historical criticism, and philosophical arguments that complicated simple certainties. Many lost their faith entirely. Others developed more nuanced, less dogmatic approaches to Christianity that put them at odds with traditional Bible Belt culture. Economic development brought similar challenges. The agricultural economy that had sustained traditional Southern communities gave way to manufacturing, technology, and service industries that required different skills and mindsets. Young people left small towns for cities where church attendance was less expected and more varied religious options were available. The integration of the military, universities, and eventually businesses forced even the most insular communities to confront racial diversity in ways that challenged traditional interpretations of Christianity. How could you maintain that segregation was biblically mandated when you worked alongside, learned from, or served under people of different races who were obviously your intellectual and moral equals? These changes accelerated dramatically in the 1990s and 2000s. The internet gave young Southerners access to information, communities, and perspectives that their parents' generation had never encountered. Online forums allowed them to ask questions about faith that would have been unwelcome in traditional church settings. They could explore different denominations, read theological scholarship, and connect with believers who held very different interpretations of Christianity. The political alliance between evangelicals and the Republican Party, which had seemed like a source of strength in the 1980s, began to produce troubling contradictions by the 2000s. How could Christians support tax cuts for the wealthy while cutting programs for the poor? How could they advocate for war while claiming to follow the Prince of Peace? How could they defend politicians whose personal behavior contradicted everything they claimed to believe about family values? These questions became particularly acute during the 2016 election, when 81% of white evangelicals supported Donald Trump despite his well-documented history of adultery, vindictive behavior, and crude public statements. For many younger Southern Christians, this support represented a fundamental betrayal of the moral authority that churches had claimed for themselves. But the transformation of the Bible Belt isn't just about people leaving Christianity entirely. It's also about the rise of new forms of faith that don't fit traditional categories. Non-denominational churches that emphasize personal relationships with Jesus over institutional authority have exploded across the region. Progressive Christian movements that combine traditional faith with liberal social positions have gained significant followings, especially in urban areas. Take the story of Reverend Julie Pennington Russell, who became the first woman pastor of First Baptist Church of Decatur, Georgia, in 2008. Her hiring created a firestorm within Southern Baptist circles, where women's ordination remains controversial. Death threats forced her to hire security. Prominent Baptist leaders denounced the decision, but the congregation stood firm, representing a new strain of Southern Christianity that maintains traditional beliefs while embracing gender equality. Similar transformations are happening across denominations. Methodist churches that were once uniformly conservative now split over LGBTQ plus inclusion. Presbyterian congregations debate immigration policy with the same intensity their grandparents brought to theological disputes. Episcopal churches in the South find themselves more liberal than their counterparts in other regions, a complete reversal of historical patterns. The numbers tell the story of this transformation in stark relief. Church attendance in the Bible Belt has dropped from its 1960s peak of over 80% to current levels closer to 50%, still higher than the national average, but representing a massive cultural shift. More importantly, the nature of that attendance has changed. Regular weekly attendance has given way to occasional participation. Financial giving has declined even faster than membership. Volunteer participation in church activities has plummeted. But perhaps the most significant change involves the social authority that churches once wielded automatically. Time was, if the Baptist minister and the Methodist preacher agreed on something, that settled community debate. Politicians sought pastoral endorsements as a matter of course. Business leaders consulted clergy before making major decisions. School boards deferred to religious considerations when developing curriculum. That automatic deference has largely disappeared. Churches now compete for influence in a crowded marketplace of ideas and institutions. They might have a voice in public debates, but it's no longer the dominant voice. Politicians court religious voters, but they don't assume that pastoral endorsements translate into electoral success. This decline in institutional authority has forced Southern churches to rediscover their prophetic voice in ways that sometimes surprise outside observers. Environmental stewardship, once dismissed as liberal politics, has become a major focus for many Bible Belt congregations who see creation care as a theological imperative. Criminal justice reform attracts support from evangelical churches that recognize the incompatibility between mass incarceration and Christian teaching about forgiveness and redemption. The opioid crisis has particularly galvanized religious communities across the South, forcing them to confront addiction as a spiritual and medical issue rather than simply a moral failing. Churches that once preached against drinking alcohol are now offering addiction recovery programs that acknowledge the complexity of substance abuse. This represents a profound shift in how Southern Christianity approaches human suffering and social problems. Immigration has created similar theological reckonings. Churches that historically supported restrictive immigration policies find themselves ministering to undocumented families who are active members of their congregations. It's difficult to maintain abstract political positions when you're looking into the eyes of children who fear their parents will be deported. The generational divide within existing congregations may be the most important factor shaping the future of the Bible Belt. Older members who lived through the region's peak Christian influence remember when church attendance was expected, when religious arguments carried automatic authority, when everyone shared basic assumptions about faith and morality. Younger members, even those who remain committed Christians, inhabit a very different cultural landscape. They've grown up with religious diversity as a normal part of life. They've been educated in schools that taught scientific theories their grandparents rejected. They've formed friendships with people of different faiths, or no faith at all. Their Christianity, even when sincere and deep, reflects these broader influences. This generational tension plays out in countless practical decisions within churches. Should contemporary worship music replace traditional hymns? Should small group studies focus on personal growth or social justice? Should church resources go toward maintaining existing programs or reaching out to new populations? Should congregations take public stands on political issues or focus purely on spiritual matters? The COVID-19 pandemic accelerated many of these existing trends in unexpected ways. Churches that had resisted online worship were forced to develop digital capabilities almost overnight. Congregants who discovered they could participate in services from home found it difficult to return to in-person worship. The pandemic exposed how much of church attendance had been driven by social expectation rather than genuine spiritual hunger. But the pandemic also revealed the continuing importance of religious community in times of crisis. Churches that adapted quickly to provide virtual connection maintained their memberships better than those that simply suspended operations. Congregations that found ways to serve their communities during lockdowns, delivering groceries, providing childcare for essential workers, offering emotional support, discovered new relevance and purpose. The economic disruption caused by the pandemic particularly affected religious giving, forcing many churches to cut staff and programs. Some congregations that had struggled financially for years were forced to close permanently. Others discovered they could operate effectively with smaller budgets and more volunteer involvement, leading to more sustainable long-term models. Technology has emerged as both a challenge and an opportunity for Bible Belt Christianity. Online church services compete with local congregations, but they also allow churches to reach audiences far beyond their geographic boundaries. A small Baptist church in rural Alabama now has regular viewers from across the country and around the world. But this same technology makes it easier for members to shop around for sermons they find more appealing or convenient. Social media has complicated traditional church authority structures. Pastors who once controlled the flow of religious information to their congregations now find their interpretations challenged by parishioners armed with Google searches and YouTube videos. Church members organize themselves around issues without waiting for pastoral leadership. Denominational authorities struggle to maintain doctrinal unity when every believer has access to alternative theological perspectives. The political polarization that has consumed American culture generally has hit Bible Belt churches with particular force, since these congregations never had to navigate significant political diversity among their membership before. Churches that assumed all their members shared conservative political views now find themselves containing Trump supporters, Biden voters, and everything in between. Some churches have responded by avoiding political topics entirely, focusing purely on spiritual matters and personal growth. Others have embraced their role as political organizing centers, becoming more explicitly partisan than ever before. Still, others attempt to model how Christians with different political views can maintain fellowship with varying degrees of success. The rise of the knowns, Americans who identify religiously as nothing in particular, has reached even the heart of the Bible Belt. This category now represents about 20% of the population in traditionally religious southern states, a percentage that was unthinkable 30 years ago. These aren't necessarily atheists or agnostics. Many maintain spiritual beliefs while rejecting organized religion entirely. The growth of this population reflects deep distrust of religious institutions rather than absence of spiritual interest. Many knowns describe themselves as spiritual but not religious, maintaining belief in God or some form of transcendence, while rejecting churches as corrupt, hypocritical, or irrelevant. For Bible Belt culture, which had always assumed that spirituality would express itself through church membership, this represents a fundamental challenge. But new forms of religious expression are emerging to fill this gap. House churches that meet in living rooms rather than sanctuaries allow for intimate community without institutional overhead. Interfaith spiritual groups bring together Christians, Muslims, Jews, and others for shared meditation and service projects. Online spiritual communities connect believers across denominational and geographic boundaries. These alternative forms of religious life often emphasize practices over beliefs, service over doctrine, and personal experience over institutional authority. They represent a more democratic, less hierarchical approach to faith that appeals particularly to younger generations who distrust traditional authority structures. The economic transformation of the South has created new challenges and opportunities for religious communities. The decline of manufacturing has devastated many traditional church communities as members lost jobs and moved away seeking employment. But the growth of technology sectors in cities like Atlanta, Austin, and Nashville has brought new populations with different religious backgrounds and expectations. These economic changes have forced many churches to reconsider their role in community development. Some congregations now operate job training programs, small business incubators, or affordable housing initiatives. Others provide childcare for working families or after-school programs for latchkey students, This social service role represents both a return to historical church functions and an adaptation to contemporary needs. The environmental movement has created surprising opportunities for theological reflection within Bible Belt Christianity. Young evangelicals increasingly see climate change as a moral issue that demands Christian response. This creation care movement challenges the political alliance between conservative Christianity and fossil fuel industries, creating new forms of religious environmentalism that maintain theological orthodoxy while embracing ecological responsibility. International missions have also evolved in ways that challenge traditional Bible Belt assumptions. Southern churches that once sent missionaries to convert the heathen now emphasize partnership with existing Christian communities around the world. These relationships have introduced new theological perspectives and worship styles that influence home congregations in unexpected ways. The changing demographics of the South have forced churches to confront their own cultural assumptions. Latino immigration has brought Catholicism and Pentecostalism to areas that were once uniformly Protestant. Asian immigration has introduced Buddhism, Hinduism, and non-Western forms of Christianity. These religious minorities remain small in most areas, but their presence has made religious diversity a lived reality rather than an abstract concept. Perhaps most significantly, the urbanization of the South has created new forms of Southern Christianity that blend traditional beliefs with cosmopolitan sensibilities. Young professionals in cities like Charlotte, Birmingham, and Little Rock maintain their faith while embracing lifestyles that would have been unthinkable in traditional Bible Belt communities. They shop at farmers markets after church, support fair trade coffee, and vote Democratic while still believing in the resurrection of Jesus Christ. These urban Southern Christians represent neither the abandonment of regional religious traditions nor their uncritical preservation, but rather their creative adaptation to contemporary realities. They demonstrate that the choice isn't necessarily between maintaining Bible Belt culture unchanged and rejecting it entirely, but rather finding ways to honor its essential insights while discarding its problematic elements. The future of the Bible Belt will likely involve continued diversification rather than either complete secularization or return to traditional uniformity. Multiple forms of Christianity will coexist alongside other religious traditions and secular worldviews. Churches that adapt to this diversity will survive and sometimes thrive. Those that insist on cultural dominance will likely continue declining. This transformation represents both loss and opportunity. The social cohesion that traditional Bible Belt culture provided was real and valuable, even when it was built on exclusion of those who didn't fit dominant patterns. The sense of shared purpose, mutual aid, and common values that characterize these communities at their best offered genuine benefits that many contemporary Southerners miss. But the new religious landscape also offers possibilities that were impossible under the old system. Greater theological diversity allows for more robust spiritual exploration. Religious freedom becomes meaningfully inclusive rather than theoretically universal but practically exclusive. Social justice movements can draw on authentic religious traditions rather than operating in opposition to faith communities. The story of the Bible Belt's transformation ultimately reflects broader American stories about the relationship between tradition and change, community and individualism, faith and freedom. The region that once seemed to offer a clear alternative to modern secular culture has instead become another site where these tensions play out in complex and sometimes surprising ways. Reverend Sarah Matthews still unlocks the doors of First Baptist Church in Meridian every Sunday morning. The congregation is smaller than it was in her grandfather's day, but it includes families he couldn't have imagined: interracial couples, single mothers, immigrants from Central America, and young professionals who commute to Jackson for work. The church building looks the same from the outside, but everything else has changed. And maybe that's the real lesson of the Bible Belt's transformation. The forms change, but the fundamental human needs that religion addresses, for meaning, community, hope, and transcendence, remain constant. Those needs are being met in new ways by new kinds of religious communities that honor the past while embracing the future. The Bible Belt isn't what it used to be, and it never will be again. But something is emerging in its place that may prove more sustainable, more inclusive, and perhaps even more faithful to the essential message of love, justice, and redemption that originally inspired these communities. Whether that something deserves to be called the Bible Belt anymore is a question each community will have to answer for itself. Thanks for joining me on this journey through one of the most significant cultural transformations in modern American history. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this topic. Have you witnessed these changes firsthand? Do you see them as positive development, tragic loss, or something more complicated? Let me know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to Professor Archive for more deep dives into the forces that have shaped American culture. Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and keep exploring the complex stories that make us who we are.